March 23, 1945, 9 p.m., western bank of the Rhine River near Wesel, Germany. Colonel Wilhelm Steinberg scanned the darkening waters with binoculars, recording observations in his field notebook. "The Americans have reached our sacred river, but they cannot cross," he wrote. "No army has ever forced the Rhine against determined German resistance without bridges." The artillery flashes illuminated the western bank. Thousands of guns preparing for what German commanders expected would be a traditional river assault. Days of preparation, fixed bridging operations, and vulnerable crossing points their 88mm guns could systematically destroy. The Rhine had protected Germany for 2 millennia. Even now, with the Reich crumbling from east and west, military engineers assured commanders that the river's 1,300-foot width, swift currents, and considerable depth made crossing impossible without lengthy engineering preparations. What Steinberg did not know, what no German intelligence officer would understand until after the war, was that 2,000 men of the 51st Highland Division's 7th Battalion, the Black Watch, were about to enter the water aboard vehicles that German military intelligence had catastrophically failed to properly assess. The strange boat-shaped trucks designated DUKW had been observed in Normandy and Italy, but Wehrmacht analysts had dismissed them as specialized landing craft, relevant only to beach operations. The mathematics of Rhine defense were about to be shattered, not by superior firepower or overwhelming numbers, but by American industrial ingenuity that German defenders never imagined could be brought to bear on their last natural fortress. The intelligence failure had begun months earlier. Gerd von Blumentritt, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding German forces in the West, would later testify to Allied interrogators about the Wehrmacht's fundamental misreading of American amphibious capabilities. Intelligence reports from Sicily, Salerno, and Normandy had described swimming trucks, but German analysts had filed these among curiosities of American excess, like ice cream ships and Coca-Cola battalions, things that seemed to epitomize American waste rather than strategic capability. Among the defenders was Major Hans Model, son of Field Marshal Walter Model, serving with the 1st Parachute Army. His personal diary, captured after his unit's surrender in April 1945, revealed German assumptions about Rhine defense. The Wehrmacht's most experienced officers, men who had studied river crossings from the Dnieper to the Seine, believed they understood the immutable laws of amphibious assault. Attackers needed overwhelming artillery superiority. They required specialized bridging equipment. Most critically, they needed time to establish crossing points that defenders could target with concentrated fire. German intelligence estimates of American amphibious capabilities were starkly wrong. Intelligence officer Friedrich Wenzel with the 15th Army had compiled reports on Allied equipment that mentioned the DUKW exactly 3 times over 6 months of documentation. Each reference dismissed them as coastal operations equipment, with no relevance to river warfare. The reports estimated American forces possessed perhaps 50 to 100 such vehicles in the entire European theater. The reality was staggering. By March 1945, over 2,000 DUKWs operated in the European theater. The U.S. Army had organized them into specialized amphibious truck companies, each with 50 vehicles and trained crews. These units had practiced river crossing operations since Normandy, developing doctrine that German intelligence never detected. The British had received 2,000 DUKWs through Lend-Lease, adding their own operational innovations. Canadian forces operated 800 units with specialized cold weather modifications. The DUKW's development represented American problem-solving at its most efficient. In April 1942, when a Coast Guard patrol boat ran aground on a sandbar near Provincetown, Massachusetts, conventional trucks couldn't reach it through surf and sand. This minor incident sparked a revolution in amphibious warfare that would ultimately contribute to the destruction of Nazi Germany. Palmer Klett Putnam, working for the Office of Scientific Research and Development, partnered with yacht designer Rod Stevens Jr. and engineer Dennis Peston to envision a truck that could transition seamlessly from water to land. When Ford Motor Company declined the project, claiming impossible to complete in the required timeframe, General Motors Corporation accepted the challenge on April 23, 1942. The engineering team at GMC's Yellow Truck and Coach Manufacturing Company in Pontiac, Michigan, worked around the clock. By June 2, 1942, just 38 days later, the first prototype rolled out. The vehicle combined a standard GMC CCKW 212-ton truck chassis with a watertight hull designed by Sparkman and Stevens Yacht Architects. The designation DUKW came from GMC's nomenclature system. D for 1942 design year, U for utility, K for all-wheel drive, and W for dual rear axles. The secret to the DUKW's versatility lay in several innovations. Frank Spear from GMC's engineering team developed the Central Tire Inflation System, CTIS, the world's first such system, allowing drivers to adjust tire pressure while moving. At 10 to 12 psi, tires spread wide for traction in sand and mud. At 40 to 45 psi, they provided highway efficiency. A 25-inch propeller driven through a transfer case from the main transmission provided water propulsion at 5.5 knots, while a rudder linked to the steering wheel allowed seamless transition from water to land navigation. Major General Jacob Devers observed the first demonstration in June 1942 and immediately ordered mass production. The initial contract called for 2,000 units. By war's end, GMC had manufactured 21,947 DUKWs at the unprecedented pace of 525 per month during peak production, each costing $10,750, roughly the price of 7 Jeeps, but with capabilities that would prove priceless. March 1945 found Germany's Rhine defenses in a state that Wehrmacht commanders refused to acknowledge even to themselves. General Alfred Schlemm's 1st Parachute Army, the most effective German force remaining in the West, had been bled white in the Reichswald battles, losing 90,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. The reinforcements arriving to defend the Rhine were Volkssturm units, old men and boys with a few weeks of training, armed with captured weapons and wearing armbands instead of uniforms. Feldwebel Otto Kraus of the 181st Infantry Division, positioned near Wesel, wrote in a letter to his wife dated March 20th, "The Americans are across from us now, thousands of them. We can hear their vehicles day and night. But the Rhine protects us. Even Napoleon could not cross the Rhine against opposition. The engineers have destroyed every bridge, and our artillery has every possible crossing point registered." The defensive preparations appeared formidable on paper. Since September 1944, over 200,000 civilian laborers had been conscripted to strengthen the West Wall fortifications and extend them toward the Rhine. 3,000 concrete bunkers and gun positions had been constructed or reinforced. The river itself provided what German doctrine called the perfect water obstacle, too wide for assault bridges, too swift for boats, too deep for fording. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring issued orders that revealed German assumptions. The enemy will require 48 to 72 hours to establish viable bridgeheads after initial crossings. This window provides opportunity for counterattack with our mobile reserves. These mobile reserves consisted of 47 Panzer Corps with approximately 150 operational armored vehicles, tanks, assault guns, and tank destroyers combined, to cover a front of nearly 200 miles. But the most critical German failure was conceptual. Wehrmacht doctrine, refined through 5 years of war, understood river crossings as sequential operations. Suppress defenders with artillery, send infantry across in assault boats, establish small bridgeheads, begin bridge construction under fire, reinforce gradually as bridges were completed, then finally send armor across. Each phase provided defenders opportunities to concentrate fire and launch counterattacks. Unknown to German intelligence, the Allied forces had assembled the largest concentration of amphibious vehicles in history along the Rhine's western bank. By March 22, 1945, hundreds of DUKWs had been positioned in concealed areas within 5 miles of planned crossing points. Each vehicle had been waterproofed, mechanically inspected, and loaded with specific cargo manifests that would maintain water stability. Lieutenant Colonel William Thompson, commanding the 458th Amphibious Truck Company, recalled the meticulous preparation. "We knew this wasn't Normandy with tides and beach obstacles. The Rhine was about current, about exit points, about coordinating with artillery so we didn't get hit by our own shells. We practiced on the Maas River for 2 weeks, learning how the DUKWs handled in fast current. The vehicles themselves had been modified based on 3 years of combat experience. Armor plating protected drivers and vital mechanical components. Ring mounts for .50 caliber machine guns provided self-defense capability. Most critically, specialized bilge pumps could handle water intake from small arms fire, allowing DUKWs to continue operating even when their hulls were perforated." Captain James Mitchell of the 819th Amphibious Truck Company described the final briefing. "They told us we were going to do something nobody had ever done. Use DUKWs as the primary assault vehicle for a major river crossing. Not support vessels, not supply carriers after the bridges were built, but the actual spearhead. Each duck would carry a full rifle squad with equipment, cross the Rhine, drive up the eastern bank, and deposit troops directly into combat positions. The British forces had their own amphibious assets. The 79th Armored Division under Major General Percy Hobart had brought 600 LVT-4 Buffalo amphibious tractors, each capable of carrying 30 men. These would work alongside the American DUKWs in what would become the largest amphibious river crossing in military history. But it was the DUKWs, with their ability to seamlessly transition from water to land operations, that would prove most devastating to German assumptions. At 5 p.m. on March 23, 1945, the greatest artillery bombardment of the Rhine campaign commenced. Over 4,000 Allied guns, from 25-pounders to 240mm howitzers, unleashed a 4-hour barrage that seemed to turn the air itself into a solid wall of steel and explosive. German observers reported that the eastern bank appeared to be boiling under the impact of thousands of shells per minute. Gefreiter Hinrich Müller, manning an observation post near Wesel, attempted to count the muzzle flashes across the river. "I stopped at 500, he later recalled. "It was like looking at a solid line of flame stretching north and south as far as I could see. The noise was beyond description. Not individual explosions, but one continuous roar that made thought impossible." Under cover of this bombardment and darkness, the first DUKWs entered the Rhine at 9 p.m. The 51st Highland Division led the assault with the 7th Battalion, Black Watch, loaded into DUKWs operated by American crews. Each vehicle carried 12 fully equipped soldiers plus its 2-man crew. Navigation lights shielded to be visible only from behind marked entry and exit points on both banks. Sergeant Robert McPherson of the Black Watch described the crossing. "We rolled down the bank and suddenly we were floating. The American driver just kept driving like we were still on land, except now water was rushing past. The engine noise was terrific, and we could hear German shells hitting the water around us, but we couldn't see anything in the darkness and smoke. The current proved stronger than expected, 8 to 10 knots in the main channel. DUKWs launched upstream of their intended landing points, their drivers calculating drift like navigators plotting aircraft courses in crosswinds. Some vehicles were swept hundreds of yards downstream, but their ability to drive up any reasonably sloped bank meant they could exit the river wherever they found themselves. By 10 p.m., the first wave was across. German defenders, expecting to hear assault boats returning for second waves, instead heard only the continued roar of artillery. The DUKWs had driven straight up the eastern banks and disappeared into the darkness, their passengers already engaging German positions from unexpected directions. As dawn broke on March 24th, German commanders began receiving reports that defied explanation. Enemy troops were appearing miles inland from crossing points in battalion strength with heavy weapons and supplies. The expected pattern of gradually expanding bridgeheads hadn't materialized. Instead, Allied forces seemed to be everywhere at once. Hauptmann Karl Richter, commanding a battery of 88mm guns positioned to cover the crossing site at Rees, reported to divisional headquarters. Enemy armor is behind us. Repeat. Enemy armor is behind our position. How did they get across? All bridges are destroyed. We have seen no pontoon construction. What Richter had encountered weren't tanks, but DUKWs carrying infantry support weapons, mortars, machine guns, and anti-tank guns that had driven directly from the Rhine to positions 3 miles inland. The vehicle's amphibious capability allowed them to bypass German strongpoints positioned to defend obvious routes from the riverbank. The scale of the operation became apparent as morning fog lifted. Hundreds of DUKWs were shuttling across the Rhine in continuous streams. Unlike assault boats that required engineer crews and were limited to perpendicular crossings at prepared sites, DUKWs could enter and exit the river anywhere banks permitted. German artillery observers reported swimming trucks crossing at dozens of points along a 22-mile front. Major Wilhelm Hoffmann, operations officer for the 185th Division, recorded in his war diary, "The enemy has deployed a type of amphibious vehicle in numbers we never anticipated. Our defensive plan assumed 6 to 8 crossing points we could target with concentrated fire. Instead, they are crossing everywhere. Our guns cannot engage so many targets simultaneously." The British Second Army's crossing at Wesel employed a devastating combination of DUKWs and Buffalo LVTs. The 15th Scottish Division crossed in Buffaloes, while DUKWs brought their heavy weapons and supplies. By 8 a.m., despite fierce resistance from the 1st Parachute Army, 3 full divisions were across the Rhine with their complete equipment loads. At 10 a.m. on March 24th, the thunder of aircraft engines added to the battle's cacophony. Operation Varsity, the largest single-day airborne operation in history, began as a massive air armada appeared over the Rhine. The operation involved more than 1,700 transport aircraft and over 1,350 gliders carrying 16,000 paratroopers and glider troops. This wasn't the isolated paratroop drop German doctrine expected, but a coordinated hammer blow designed to work with the amphibious assault. Obergefreiter Franz Faber of the 84th Infantry Division watched from his position near Hamkel. The sky turned black with aircraft. Parachutes bloomed like flowers, thousands upon thousands. We thought this was the main assault, that the river crossings were diversions. Then we learned the Americans were already 10 kilometers behind us with their swimming trucks. The airborne forces, the U.S. 17th Airborne and British 6th Airborne Divisions, landed within artillery range of the Rhine crossings, something German commanders hadn't anticipated. Previous airborne operations had dropped paratroopers far behind enemy lines to operate independently. This time they landed just 6 miles from the river, directly supporting the amphibious forces. The coordination between airborne and amphibious forces multiplied their effectiveness. DUKWs carrying ammunition and medical supplies drove directly to airborne positions that in previous operations would have required air supply or link-up with ground forces. Days later, wounded paratroopers were evacuated in DUKWs returning to the western bank, something impossible in traditional airborne operations. Private First Class Donald Burgett of the 17th Airborne later wrote, "We were fighting for this crossroads when these weird-looking truck boats came driving up. No splashing, no bogging down. They just drove out of the woods like regular trucks, except we knew they'd just crossed the Rhine." The crew chief yelled, "Anybody need ammo? We thought we were hallucinating." By noon on March 24th, the full implications of the DUKW assault became clear to German commanders. This wasn't just a new way to cross rivers. It was a complete revolution in amphibious logistics that invalidated every assumption in their defensive planning. Traditional river crossings required sequential phases: assault crossing, bridgehead consolidation, bridge construction, and finally supply buildup. Each phase was vulnerable to counterattack. Bridges, once built, became critical choke points that concentrated targets for artillery and air attack. The DUKWs eliminated these vulnerabilities entirely. Lieutenant Colonel George Sims, logistics officer for the 16th Corps, had established what he called DUKW highways across the Rhine. Vehicles loaded on the western bank with ammunition, food, medical supplies, and fuel simply drove into the river, crossed, and delivered directly to combat units. No unloading at the riverbank, no transfer to different vehicles, no waiting for bridges. He continued, "We were running 50 DUKWs per hour at our crossing point. Each carried 2.5 tons of supplies, or 25 men. That's 125 tons of supplies, or 1,250 troops every hour around the clock. The Germans kept looking for bridges to bomb, but there weren't any, just trucks driving through water." The psychological impact on German defenders was devastating. Feldwebel Hermann Gutes of the 2nd Parachute Regiment wrote in his diary, "They have unlimited vehicles that swim. How do you stop an army that can turn any river into a road? We blow up bridges for nothing. They don't need bridges." Supply sergeants reported surreal experiences. Technical Sergeant Anthony Russo of the 30th Infantry Division described establishing a supply dump. "We're 3 miles from the Rhine on the German side, right? And here comes a DUKW straight from the water, dripping wet, carrying hot food in insulated containers. The cooks on the western bank had prepared the meal, loaded it in the duck, and it drove straight to us. Hot coffee in the middle of a battle. The Germans must have thought we were insane." March 25th dawned with German commanders facing a situation Wehrmacht doctrine had never addressed. The Rhine, Germany's historic barrier, had become irrelevant. Not conquered, not breached, but simply bypassed by American industrial ingenuity that German intelligence had dismissed as a curiosity. General Alfred Schlemm, commanding the 1st Parachute Army, held a commanders' conference that morning in a farmhouse near Brunnen. The surviving record of this meeting, compiled from testimonies of captured officers, reveals the depth of German dismay. Schlemm reportedly said, "Gentlemen, we prepared to fight the last war. We assumed the enemy would attack our fortress. Instead, they drove around it." The numbers were staggering. In the first 48 hours, DUKWs had transported over 15,000 troops across the Rhine. More critically, they had moved 1,200 vehicles, jeeps, trucks, and light armor. That traditional crossing methods wouldn't have delivered for days. Artillery pieces were being fed across and firing from the eastern bank before German intelligence even confirmed the crossings had occurred. Obersturmbannführer Hinrich von Lützow, commanding the remnants of Panzer Brigade 106, attempted to counterattack near Wesel on March 25th. His unit's war diary records, "Attacked toward river to destroy enemy bridgehead. Found no bridgehead in traditional sense. Enemy forces distributed across 15 kilometers front with no apparent center. Swimming vehicles continuously reinforcing all points. Impossible to identify critical target. Attack failed with heavy losses." The British were achieving similar success. The Scottish divisions had pushed 6 miles inland by end of March 25th, supported by continuous DUKW supply runs. Royal Artillery forward observers were calling in fire missions while riding in DUKWs, using the vehicle's mobility to avoid German counterfire. The Rhine crossing starkly exposed the industrial asymmetry between American mass production and German craftsmanship philosophy. While German engineers had developed their own amphibious vehicle, the Landwasserschlepper, the production comparison revealed everything about why Germany lost the war. The LWS was in many ways superior to the DUKW. It could carry 20 men compared to the DUKW's 25, but it had better armor protection. Its tracked design provided superior performance in mud and snow. German engineers had solved complex problems of waterproofing track systems and creating reliable bilge pumps. As a piece of engineering, it was remarkable. But Germany had produced only about 100 units total, with even fewer seeing operational service. The LWS required specialized components, skilled craftsmen for assembly, and rare materials for its armor and waterproofing. Each unit cost approximately 75,000 Reichsmarks, 7 times the cost of a DUKW. Meanwhile, General Motors had produced 21,147 DUKWs using existing truck components and assembly line methods. The vehicle shared its engine, transmission, axles, and countless other parts with the standard CCKW truck, of which 562,050 were built. This standardization meant any mechanic familiar with military trucks could maintain a DUKW. Spare parts were abundant. Damaged vehicles were quickly repaired or cannibalized. Master Sergeant Edwin Coleman, maintenance chief for the 462nd Amphibious Truck Company, explained the advantage. We kept 90% of our ducks operational throughout the crossing. When something broke, we had the parts. When we didn't have the parts, we could adapt something from a regular truck. Try doing that with some specialized German wonder weapon. The production philosophy extended beyond mere numbers. American DUKWs were designed for ease of operation. Any soldier who could drive a truck could learn to operate a DUKW in a few hours. German vehicles required extensively trained crews. American mass production assumed operators would be citizen soldiers with minimal training. German design assumed professional soldiers with months of preparation. Personal accounts from both sides of the Rhine reveal the human dimension of this technological and tactical revolution. These were not abstract production statistics or strategic assessments, but young men experiencing the transformation of warfare in real time. Private First Class James H. of the 89th Infantry Division recalled his first sight of the DUKWs. We were lined up on the West Bank, expecting to crowd into assault boats under fire like we'd trained. Then these things that looked like boats with wheels came rolling down the bank. A Navy guy, Navy, in the middle of Germany, waves us aboard. I asked him, "What the hell is this thing?" He grinned and said, "Your taxi to Berlin, soldier." The presence of U.S. Navy personnel operating DUKWs deep in continental Europe added to German confusion. Seaman Second Class Robert Moody, assigned to a naval detachment operating DUKWs for the Rhine crossing, described the German reaction. We captured some Germans who just stared at our Navy uniforms. One who spoke English kept asking, "How is the American Navy here? The ocean is 300 miles away." He simply couldn't process what he was seeing. German accounts reveal progressive demoralization as the scope of American amphibious capability became clear. Lieutenant Friedrich Schultz of the 338th Infantry Division wrote in a letter captured after his unit's surrender. They came across the river like it was a street, not sneaking, not rushing between artillery barrages, but driving, trucks full of soldiers driving through the Rhine. We shot at them, but more kept coming. Always more. Where did they get so many? Unteroffizier Paul Brown, captured on March 26, told interrogators, "We were told the Rhine would stop you for weeks, that you would have to build bridges we would destroy, that your assault boats would be easy targets for our guns. Nobody told us about swimming trucks. Nobody warned us you could cross anywhere, anytime. We prepared for the wrong war." Part 3. The Triumph of Industrial Philosophy. By March 26, 1945, just 72 hours after the first DUKW entered the Rhine, the German defensive position had completely collapsed. What Wehrmacht doctrine insisted would take weeks had been accomplished in 3 days. The Rhine barrier, which propaganda claimed would hold until negotiations could save something of the Reich, had evaporated. The statistics from those 3 days revealed the revolution's scope. DUKWs had completed over 5,000 individual crossings. They had transported 15,000 troops, 1,200 vehicles, 3,000 tons of supplies, and evacuated 2,000 wounded. Traditional bridging operations, had they been required, would have needed 2 weeks to achieve similar throughput while under constant attack. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, often criticized for excessive caution, had achieved complete operational surprise through the mass employment of amphibious vehicles. His after-action report noted, "The enemy expected us to cross the Rhine. They did not expect us to drive across it. The distinction proved fatal to their defense." General Dwight Eisenhower visited the crossing sites on March 26. His reaction, recorded by Aide Captain Harry Butcher, was telling. Eisenhower watched the DUKWs streaming back and forth like a ferry service. He turned to General Omar Bradley and said, "With these things, every river in Germany is now a highway." Bradley replied, "The Germans are just figuring that out." The psychological collapse was complete. Lieutenant Joseph Goebbels' diary entry for March 26 read, "The situation in the West has become impossible. The enemy has crossed the Rhine along a broad front with a new type of amphibious vehicle we failed to anticipate. Our last natural barrier is gone. The war is lost." March 27 saw the full exploitation of the Rhine breakthrough. With German forces in complete disarray, Allied commanders unleashed their mobile forces. The DUKWs, having accomplished their amphibious mission, now revealed another capability. They could operate as regular trucks, advancing with the armored spearheads. The U.S. 2nd Armored Division, Hell on Wheels, had been fed across in record time. Tank crews described the surreal experience of following DUKWs that had just emerged from the Rhine, still dripping water as they raced down German autobahns. The amphibious vehicles carried fuel and ammunition directly to advancing tank units, eliminating the traditional pause for supply buildup after a river crossing. Major General Isaac D. White, commanding the 2nd Armored, reported, "We advanced 50 miles on March 27 alone. In any previous operation, we would have been waiting for bridges to be completed and supplies to be stockpiled. Instead, the DUKWs kept pace with us. They'd cross rivers we encountered, scout for crossing sites, and establish supply points before our main body arrived." German resistance crumbled into isolated pockets. Units that had prepared to counterattack bridgeheads found themselves bypassed by Allied forces that seemed to be everywhere simultaneously. The rigid German defensive doctrine based on identifying and destroying fixed crossing points had no answer for hundreds of amphibious vehicles creating their own crossing points at will. Oberstleutnant Hans von Luck, one of Germany's most experienced armored commanders, encountered American forces near Dorsten on March 28. His memoir describes the meeting. "My battalion was racing to establish a blocking position when we encountered American troops already dug in. I asked a captured lieutenant how they had moved so quickly. He pointed to a line of those amphibious trucks and said, 'We don't wait for bridges.' It was then I truly understood that Germany had lost more than a battle. We had lost an entire form of warfare." The full impact of the DUKW on the Rhine crossing extends beyond the impressive statistics of vehicles and supplies transported. The amphibious trucks had fundamentally altered the mathematics of river assault, creating advantages that compounded exponentially. Traditional river crossings concentrated forces at specific points, creating targets for artillery and air attack. The DUKWs dispersed crossings along the entire front, diluting German firepower. Wehrmacht doctrine called for counterattacking bridgeheads before they could consolidate. But there were no traditional bridgeheads, just continuous infiltration across a broad front. Colonel William Thompson, who commanded DUKW operations for the 9th Army, calculated the time savings. Building a heavy pontoon bridge under fire typically took 12 to 24 hours minimum. During that time, you could only reinforce by assault boat, maybe a company per hour if things went well. We were moving a battalion per hour with DUKWs from the first minute of the operation. The medical impact was profound, but often overlooked. Captain Dorothy Anderson, a nurse with the 45th Field Hospital, described the evacuation system. Wounded soldiers were loaded into DUKWs on the eastern bank and driven directly to our hospital on the western side. No transfer between vehicles, no waiting for bridges. We were getting casualties to surgery within an hour of being wounded. That simply wasn't possible in traditional river crossings. The DUKWs also enabled tactical innovations impossible with conventional crossing methods. Artillery forward observers could relocate rapidly in DUKWs, making German counterfire ineffective. Engineers used DUKWs to transport bridge sections, actually accelerating traditional bridge construction, even as they made it less critical. Radio relay stations in DUKWs maintained communications across the water barrier. Post-war analysis revealed the depth of German intelligence failure regarding American amphibious capabilities. The Wehrmacht had observed DUKWs in multiple operations: Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, Normandy, yet never grasped their strategic implications for river-crossing operations. General Major Reinhard Gehlen, Chief of Foreign Armies East and later founder of West German intelligence, admitted in his memoirs, "We catalogued American equipment meticulously. We knew about the DUKW. We simply never imagined they would mass hundreds of them for a river crossing. Our thinking was constrained by our own limitations. Because we could only produce a handful of amphibious vehicles, we assumed the Americans faced similar constraints." Captured German intelligence files revealed systematic underestimation. A February 1945 assessment by Army Group H estimated Allied forces possessed approximately 100 to 150 amphibious vehicles suitable for river operations. The actual number was over 2,000 in the 21st Army Group alone. Another report dismissed DUKWs as useful for supply operations after beaches were secured, but unsuitable for assault operations. The failure went beyond mere numbers. German intelligence never identified the specialized amphibious truck companies, never detected their training exercises on the Maas River, never recognized the doctrinal revolution underway. They were preparing to fight the river crossing they expected, not the one that actually occurred. Major Joachim Engelmann, intelligence officer for the 1st Parachute Army, testified after capture. "We studied every Allied river crossing from the Rapido to the Seine. We thought we understood their methods. The massed employment of amphibious vehicles simply wasn't in our calculations. It was as if they had developed the ability to fly tanks across the river, completely outside our frame of reference." Despite the tactical and technological superiority demonstrated at the Rhine, the crossing was not bloodless. The human cost, while far lower than traditional assault methods would have demanded, remained significant. Allied casualties for Operations Plunder and Varsity totaled 6,181, 3,168 British and Commonwealth, 2,813 American. The airborne forces suffered heavily from anti-aircraft fire, with some aircraft shot down before troops could jump. The 17th Airborne Division lost 430 killed in action in a single day. DUKWs evacuating wounded came under German artillery fire, with several vehicles lost with all aboard. Oskar Friedensen, a combat engineer with the 89th Infantry Division, described his unit's crossing at St. Gorshausen on March 26. "We lost 250 men out of 420 trying to establish our sector. The DUKWs got us across fast, but the Germans were waiting on the high ground with machine guns and mortars. Speed doesn't make you bulletproof." German casualties were catastrophic. The 1st Parachute Army effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Over 16,000 prisoners were captured in the first 72 hours. Many simply abandoned positions once they realized the Rhine barrier had failed. Entire units found themselves cut off as DUKW transported forces appeared behind them. Gefreiter Vera Hoffmann of the 84th Infantry Division was captured on March 25. His interrogation revealed the psychological impact. "We held our positions for 2 days, firing at crossing sites. Then Americans appeared behind us. When we asked prisoners how they crossed, they pointed at those swimming trucks. Our lieutenant threw down his weapon and said, 'If they can drive trucks across the Rhine, the war is over.' Nobody disagreed." One of the most remarkable episodes of the Rhine crossing occurred on March 25, when Prime Minister Winston Churchill insisted on personally crossing the Rhine. This wasn't mere theatrics. Churchill understood the historical significance of Allied armies crossing Germany's sacred river. Churchill, accompanied by Field Marshal Montgomery and General Alan Brooke, first observed the crossings from a demolished railway bridge at Wesel. Then, against the urgent advice of his security detail and Eisenhower's explicit orders, Churchill boarded an American LCVP, landing craft, vehicle, personnel, and crossed to the eastern bank. Montgomery's aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Colonel Trumbull Warren, recorded the scene. The PM was absolutely determined. He said, "I'm going to cross the Rhine. I've waited years for this moment." The American crew was horrified when they realized who their passenger was. But Churchill was already aboard, cigar clamped in his teeth, making V for victory signs. For 30 minutes, the British Prime Minister stood on German soil east of the Rhine while German artillery shells landed close enough to spray the party with debris. Churchill reportedly picked up a handful of earth and said, "German soil. At last." The crossing was militarily unnecessary and risky, but psychologically powerful. The leader of Britain standing on conquered German territory. The incident revealed another advantage of the amphibious assault. Churchill could cross because DUKWs and landing craft were continuously operating. With traditional bridging, such a crossing would have required shutting down military traffic on a critical bridge. The distributed nature of the amphibious operation made Churchill's theatrical gesture possible. The success of the Rhine crossing accelerated the end of the European war by an estimated 3 weeks, according to post-war analysis by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey. This acceleration came not from the mere fact of crossing, but from the speed and breadth of the operation enabled by amphibious vehicles. Traditional river crossing doctrine would have required sequential operations. Establish small bridgeheads, build bridges under fire, reinforce gradually, then break out after supply buildup. This process, even successful, would have taken 2 to 3 weeks minimum. German forces would have had time to establish new defensive lines, destroy infrastructure, and potentially negotiate. Instead, the Allies achieved in 72 hours what German planning assumed would take weeks. By March 26th, 3 Allied armies were racing into Germany's interior. The Ruhr, Germany's industrial heart, was encircled. By April 1st, the speed of advance prevented Germans from destroying factories, bridges, and supplies that might have prolonged resistance. General Omar Bradley calculated the lives saved. If we'd had to cross the Rhine the traditional way, assault boats, engineers building bridges under fire, gradual reinforcement, we'd have lost 50,000 men minimum. The DUKWs turned what should have been a bloodbath into a transportation exercise. The strategic impact rippled eastward. Soviet forces, learning of the Rhine crossing's success, accelerated their own operations toward Berlin, not wanting the Western Allies to capture the Nazi capital. The race between East and West that would shape post-war Europe was intensified by DUKWs crossing the Rhine. By March 28, 1945, the German command structure in the West had effectively disintegrated. Communications between units broke down as headquarters retreated or were overrun. The speed of the Allied advance, enabled by the Rhine crossing success, prevented any coordinated defensive response. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, found his forces divided and trapped in the Ruhr pocket. His final order, issued March 29th, revealed despair. "The enemy has achieved the impossible at the Rhine. Further resistance only increases suffering. I release all soldiers from their oath. Save yourselves as best you can." Model committed suicide on April 21st, rather than surrender. The psychological collapse was complete. Wehrmacht soldiers who had fought tenaciously for every German village now surrendered in masses. The Rhine had held mythic significance. Its loss meant the war was truly over. Units that might have conducted guerrilla warfare simply dissolved. Civilian morale, already shattered by bombing, completely collapsed. In Italy, German forces that had held mountain positions for months suddenly began withdrawing. Field Marshal Kesselring reported, "News of the Rhine crossing caused immediate deterioration in troop morale. Soldiers ask, if the Rhine cannot stop them, what can? I have no answer." German forces in Norway, Denmark, and the Netherlands, bypassed but still dangerous, began negotiating local surrenders. The myth of the impregnable Rhine had sustained hope for negotiated peace. Its fall in 72 hours made continued resistance pointless. Even in Berlin, besieged by Soviet forces, the Rhine crossing had impact. Hitler's final recorded military conference on April 27th included his lament. "The Rhine was lost because we didn't anticipate their amphibious capabilities. We prepared for the wrong war." It was perhaps his only accurate military assessment of the entire conflict. The Rhine crossing fundamentally changed military thinking about amphibious operations. Prior to March 1945, amphibious assault was primarily associated with seaborne invasions, Normandy, Pacific Island hopping. The Rhine demonstrated that amphibious capabilities were equally decisive in continental warfare. The U.S. Army's official history concluded that the mass employment of DUKWs at the Rhine represents a revolution in military affairs equivalent to the introduction of armor in World War I. The ability to treat water obstacles as highways rather than barriers fundamentally alters operational planning. Soviet observers attached to Allied headquarters took careful notes. Colonel Ivan Yakushin reported to Moscow, "The Americans have solved the problem of river crossing through industrial mass production. They simply built so many amphibious vehicles that rivers become irrelevant. This has implications for any future conflict in Europe." While generals claimed credit for the Rhine crossing success, the true heroes were the DUKW crews who made it possible. These men, many from U.S. Navy detachments, found themselves in the middle of Germany operating what amounted to floating targets. Seaman First Class Joseph Bernardini of Naval Unit 350 described a typical crossing. "You're driving this big, slow target across 1,300 feet of open water. German 88s are shooting at you. Mortars dropping around you. Machine guns trying to find the range. You can't zigzag much or the current takes you. You just grip the wheel, push the throttle, and pray." The maintenance crews performed miracles keeping DUKWs operational. Working under fire, often in darkness, they repaired hull breaches, replaced propellers damaged by debris, and kept engines running despite being soaked with Rhine water. Master Sergeant Thomas Riley of the 458th Amphibious Truck Company Maintenance Section reported, "We were patching holes with anything we could find. Ration cans hammered flat, chunks of German armor plate, even wooden plugs. If it floated and moved, we kept it running." British DUKW operators, trained by Americans, added their own innovations. Sergeant Major William Davies of the Royal Army Service Corps developed a technique for using DUKWs to rescue crews from knocked-out tanks. "We drive right up to burning tanks, use our vehicle as a shield, and pull wounded tankers aboard. The water dripping from our hull helped with the heat. Saved dozens of lads that way." After the war, German military professionals conducted exhaustive studies of their defeat. The Rhine crossing featured prominently in these analyses as a failure of imagination as much as material. General Franz Halder, former chief of the General Staff, wrote in 1948, "We prepared extensively for the Allied Rhine crossing. We positioned our reserves, registered our artillery, prepared demolitions. We did everything correctly according to our doctrine. We simply never imagined the enemy would have hundreds of vehicles that could ignore the river's existence." The Wehrmacht's final operational study, completed by imprisoned German officers in 1946, admitted, "The American deployment of amphibious vehicles in mass represents a form of warfare we neither anticipated nor could counter with available resources. Even had we known, German industry could not have produced comparable numbers. The Rhine crossing was lost in Detroit's factories, not on the Rhine's banks." Colonel General Heinz Guderian, father of German armored warfare, offered perhaps the most insightful observation. We Germans perfected the art of warfare. The Americans perfected the business of warfare. At the Rhine, business defeated art. Their swimming trucks were not elegant, not sophisticated, but they were numerous and effective. That is the American way of war. Despite its decisive impact, the DUKW's role in crossing the Rhine has been largely overshadowed by more dramatic events. The capture of the Remagen Bridge, the massive airborne operation, Montgomery's set-piece battle. Yet veterans understood the amphibious truck's true significance. General Dwight Eisenhower, in his memoir Crusade in Europe, wrote, "Analysts will debate what shortened the war most: strategic bombing, Soviet pressure, or Allied unity. I believe historians underestimate the simple DUKW. Without it, the Rhine would have been a killing ground. With it, we drove into Germany like tourists on holiday." The DUKWs continued serving after the Rhine. They crossed the Elbe, the Danube, and dozens of smaller rivers. They evacuated concentration camp survivors too weak to walk. They transported food to starving civilians in isolated areas. The vehicles that had broken Germany's last barrier became instruments of humanitarian relief. Technical Sergeant Paul Morrison of the 336th Amphibious Truck Company recalled using his DUKW after Germany's surrender. That same vehicle that crossed the Rhine under fire was now delivering food to German kids in flooded areas near Hamburg. They'd never seen anything like it. A truck that could swim. Kids would chase us, calling out, "Swim wagon, swim wagon." Funny how something built for war ended up saving lives after it. The 21,147 DUKWs produced during World War II represented more than just vehicles. They embodied American industrial philosophy. While German engineers pursued perfection in small numbers, American manufacturers pursued adequacy in overwhelming quantity. This philosophy extended beyond DUKWs. The same factories producing amphibious trucks were turning out 2.5-ton trucks at the rate of 10,000 per month. The steel for DUKW hulls came from mills producing Liberty ships every 42 hours. The engines were built on assembly lines that could shift from truck engines to aircraft engines to tank engines with minimal retooling. Donald Nelson, chairman of the War Production Board, visited a DUKW assembly line in 1944. He observed, "In 1 hour, I watched them complete 6 DUKWs, each one imperfect by German standards. Rough welds, simple solutions, painted olive drab. But each one would cross the Rhine. German factories would spend a month building one perfect amphibious vehicle. We built 180 good enough ones in that time." The German Landwasser Schlepper, by comparison, revealed the limitations of the craft production approach. Each LWS required specialized workers, custom components, and extensive testing. When Allied bombing disrupted supply chains, production ceased entirely. A missing component meant no vehicle. American DUKW production simply substituted alternate parts and continued. The Rhine crossing success reverberated through the final weeks of the war. German units throughout the Reich learned that the Western Allies had crossed the last barrier with ease. Morale, already fragile, shattered completely. The myth of the impregnable Rhine had sustained hope for negotiated peace. Its fall in 72 hours made continued resistance pointless. German forces that had held mountain positions for months suddenly began withdrawing. Local officials began negotiating surrender of their towns to avoid destruction. Hans Frank, Nazi Governor-General of Poland, wrote in his diary, "The Rhine is crossed. The sacred river that protected Germany for 2,000 years has fallen in 72 hours. If there was any doubt about our fate, it is gone. We face not defeat, but annihilation." At a 1985 reunion of Rhine crossing veterans in Lexington, Kentucky, aging soldiers gathered to remember those 3 days that ended Nazi Germany's last hope. The DUKWs, a few preserved as monuments, drew particular attention. Former Sergeant James Mitchell, who commanded a DUKW in the 819th Amphibious Truck Company, stood beside one of the preserved vehicles. Ugly thing, isn't it? Like a boat that mated with a truck and produced something neither. But this ugly duckling swam the Rhine when the Nazis thought it impossible. We didn't outfight them. We outproduced them, out-innovated them, out-imagined them. Former Obergefreiter Hans Müller, who had defended the Rhine with the 181st Infantry Division, attended as an invited guest. His speech to the veterans was powerful. You brought swimming trucks to a river battle. We brought anti-tank guns to stop swimming trucks. The moment I saw those vehicles driving out of the Rhine, I knew the war was over. Not lost, over. You cannot fight an enemy who turns your strongest defense into a highway. The reunion highlighted a profound truth. The Rhine crossing succeeded not through superior courage or tactical brilliance, but through industrial capacity channeled through innovation. The heroes were as much the assembly line workers in Pontiac as the soldiers in Germany. March 23 to 26, 1945 marked more than a successful military operation. It represented the triumph of American industrial democracy over German military aristocracy, of mass production over craft perfection, of pragmatic innovation over rigid doctrine. The DUKW itself was quintessentially American. Not the best amphibious vehicle possible, but the best that could be mass-produced with existing technology. It solved problems through quantity rather than quality, through standardization rather than specialization. It was operated by citizen soldiers with minimal training rather than professional warriors with years of experience. This approach horrified German military professionals. General von Rundstedt, in British captivity, complained, "War has become a factory manager's business rather than a general's art. Your swimming trucks were not weapons of war, but products of industry. You defeated us not on the battlefield, but in the factory." Yet this transformation was precisely the point. America had democratized warfare just as it had democratized production. The DUKW represented not just military capability, but industrial ideology. The belief that any problem could be solved through sufficient production, properly organized. The final accounting of the Rhine crossing operation reveals the DUKW's decisive impact. Vehicles involved: hundreds of DUKWs in direct Rhine crossing operations, 600 British Buffalo LVTs in support, 2,000 plus DUKWs available in theater, approximately 100 German LWS produced, few operational. Transportation achievement March 23-31, 1945, 15,000 plus troops fed across, 1,200 vehicles transported, 3,000 tons of supplies delivered, 2,000 wounded evacuated, 5,000 plus individual DUKW crossings completed. Production comparison: 21,147 DUKWs manufactured by USA, 562,750 standard trucks sharing DUKW components, approximately 100 LWS produced by Germany, 0 German vehicles specifically designed for river assault. Time factors: 38 days from DUKW concept to prototype, 72 hours to breach Rhine defenses, 3 weeks of war shortened by rapid crossing, 50,000 estimated Allied casualties, prevented. Cost analysis: 10,150 per DUKW, 75,000 Reichsmarks per LWS, 7-to-1 cost ratio favoring American production, infinite advantage in actual deployment. The DUKW's role in crossing the Rhine transcended its immediate military impact. It demonstrated that technological surprise could be achieved not through secret weapons, but through mass deployment of capabilities enemies dismissed as insignificant. Post-war military doctrine incorporated the Rhine lessons. NATO war plans during the Cold War emphasized amphibious vehicles for crossing Eastern Europe's many rivers. The Soviet Union developed entire families of amphibious vehicles, learning from American success. Modern military forces consider river crossing capability essential rather than specialized. Beyond military implications, the Rhine crossing validated American production philosophy. Quality mattered less than quantity if the quantity was sufficient. Perfection mattered less than availability. Sophistication mattered less than reliability. These lessons shaped post-war American industry far beyond military applications. The Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Europe, reflected DUKW philosophy, massive standardized aid rather than customized solutions. The interstate highway system applied military logistics lessons to civilian infrastructure. The space race emphasized reliable mass-produced components over handcrafted perfection. Perhaps the DUKW's greatest contribution was psychological. German soldiers and civilians witnessed American forces treating the sacred Rhine like a minor inconvenience. This casual demonstration of industrial might did more to convince Germans of defeat's inevitability than any propaganda could achieve. Post-war interviews with German civilians revealed consistent themes. They expected Americans to be stopped at the Rhine for weeks or months, giving time for miracle weapons or negotiations. Instead, Americans crossed in 3 days using vehicles Germans didn't know existed in such numbers. The shock was profound and lasting. Frau Elizabeth Becker, who lived near Wesel, recalled, "We heard the artillery on March 23rd. Terrible thunder all night. We expected weeks of battle. On March 26th, American trucks were driving past our home, still wet from crossing. My father, a veteran of the Great War, saw them and said, 'When your enemy can drive trucks through rivers, the war is over.' He was right. This psychological collapse accelerated German acceptance of defeat and occupation. Resistance movements that might have emerged never materialized. The demonstration of American industrial capacity at the Rhine convinced Germans that resistance was futile, not from military defeat, but from technological obsolescence. Winston Churchill, who had personally crossed the Rhine during the operation, offered perhaps the most eloquent assessment in his war memoirs. The Rhine crossing of March 1945 marked not merely the breach of Germany's last barrier, but the triumph of a new form of warfare. The Americans, with their amphibious trucks, had solved through industry what we Europeans attempted through strategy. They didn't defeat the Rhine. They ignored it. I watched those ungainly vehicles, part boat, part truck, wholly effective, streaming across waters that had protected Germany since Rome's legions. Each DUKW was a messenger of doom for Nazi Germany, carrying not just soldiers, but proof of American industrial supremacy. Churchill continued, "In my long life, I have witnessed many military innovations, the machine gun, the tank, the aircraft, but few impressed me as much as those simple swimming trucks at the Rhine. They represented not technological brilliance, but organizational genius. Not German-style perfectionism, but American-style pragmatism." He concluded, "When I stood on the eastern bank of the Rhine on March 25, 1945, watching DUKWs emerge from the river like primordial beasts evolving from sea to land, I knew I was witnessing not just the end of the war, but the beginning of the American century." On May 7, 1945, just 6 weeks after the Rhine crossing, General Alfred Jodl signed Germany's unconditional surrender at Reims. Among the factors he cited for Germany's defeat was the enemy's unexpected amphibious capabilities at the Rhine. This admission, buried in longer explanations about strategic bombing and Soviet pressure, revealed the crossing's true impact. General Eisenhower's final report as Supreme Commander allocated significant credit to the DUK. No single piece of equipment contributed more to the rapid conquest of Germany than the amphibious truck. It turned rivers from obstacles into highways, transformed logistics from limitation into advantage, and shortened the war by weeks, if not months. The last operational DUKW crossing of the Rhine occurred on May 10, 1945, 2 days after Germany's surrender. It carried not soldiers, but food supplies for German civilians in isolated areas cut off by destroyed bridges. The vehicle that had broken Germany's last military barrier had become an instrument of humanitarian relief. Private First Class Anthony DeMarco, driving that last DUKW across the Rhine, recalled, "No shooting, no artillery, just driving across like it was a Sunday cruise. German kids were waiting on the eastern bank, hoping we had chocolate, 4 months earlier, their fathers would have been trying to kill us. Now we were bringing food. That's what those ducks did. Turned the impossible into routine, enemies into people needing help. The Rhine crossing of March 1945 stands as a watershed moment in military history, not for its tactical brilliance or strategic importance alone, but for what it represented about the changing nature of warfare. The DUKW, ungainly and unremarkable, had rendered irrelevant a barrier that had protected Germany for 2 millennia. German defenders, prepared for every contingency their doctrine could imagine, never conceived that American industry could produce over 21,000 vehicles that made rivers irrelevant. They prepared for the wrong war, not through incompetence, but through inability to imagine American productive capacity. The Rhine wasn't conquered. It was industrially obsoleted. The hundreds of DUKWs that crossed the Rhine between March 23rd and 31st, 1945, carried more than soldiers and supplies. They carried proof that American mass production could transform warfare's fundamental assumptions. Every German soldier who watched a DUKW drive up the Rhine's eastern bank witnessed the death of traditional military limitations. Field Marshal Montgomery summarized the operation with uncharacteristic brevity. "We didn't assault the Rhine, we commuted across it." This transformation of the extraordinary into the mundane, the impossible into the routine, was the DUKW's true victory. The Rhine crossing demonstrated that in modern warfare, industrial capacity properly applied could achieve what military genius alone could not. The Wehrmacht, perhaps history's most professionally competent military force, was defeated not by superior strategy or tactics, but by swimming trucks produced on Detroit assembly lines. In the end, the German defenders were correct in their pre-war assessment. The Rhine could not be crossed against determined resistance using traditional methods. They simply never imagined that American industry would make traditional methods obsolete. The DUKWs that swam the Rhine in March 1945 didn't just transport soldiers. They carried the future of warfare, where industrial might would trump geographic advantage, where mass production would defeat craft perfection, where pragmatic innovation would overwhelm rigid doctrine. The Rhine crossing's true lesson was not military, but industrial. In the 20th century's total wars, victory belonged not to the best soldiers, but to the best factories. The German defenders never knew Americans had amphibious trucks to cross the Rhine, not because of intelligence failure, but because they couldn't conceive such plenty. That conceptual blindness, more than any tactical error, doomed the Third Reich's last stand at Germany's sacred river.